Finally, I reached the object of this trip, the Great Ocean Road. This legendary road stretches almost from Melbourne to Adelaide, along the south coast of Australia. The views from the cliffside roads are breathtaking, and it's home to the instantly recognizable 12 Apostles. If you do visit, be prepared. This is one of Australia's most famous tourist destinations, and in early February, in summer, it was still peak tourist season for this area. Despite the crowds, it's totally worth it. Although it only took me about 3 days to pass through the whole area, and about 7 days to get there, it was one of the most memorable parts of the trip. After driving south through rural Victoria, I reached Geelong at about 3 in the afternoon, but barely stopped before moving on to Torquay, where I found a caravan park to stay for the night. After Torquay, I headed to a very special location that I've been looking forward to the whole trip. Aireys Inlet is a small town much like any other located along the Great Ocean Road, but if you grew up in Australia during the 1990s, this town has a location which you are bound to recognize. This inconspicuous lighthouse on the cliffs near the town outside of Aireys Inlet is where the Australian TV show Round the Twist was filmed, and strangely enough, it was one of the highlights of the whole trip for me. Even though this place was packed by foreign tourists, I can't imagine that it was much more than a scenic stop on their trip. But for me, this was a surreal return to the 1990s and my childhood. After this, I continued through Lorne and to Apollo Bay. This area, so I've been told, is incredibly beautiful if you venture a little way off the road towards the Otway National Park. Even though I didn't pass this way myself, from what I saw at Lavers Hill, which was a small inland town that I passed through, this would have been an incredibly scenic road to travel through. I can't speak to the natural beauty of the Otway National Park, but I can talk about the rainforest around Lavers Hill, and I will in a minute. But first, I want to tell you about my favorite camping site from the whole trip. Right now, I'll leave you with some of the gorgeous footage that I took from this area, but if you want to hear about the camping site, skip to 1 hour and 36 minutes into the video. After Apollo Bay and Cape Otway, I came to a town called Lavers Hill. The town isn't much more than 2 cafes and a motel, but just before the town is probably my favorite campsite that I have ever spent the night at. The first thing I loved about the campsite was the road to the side, which you can see here. It was windy and scenic and mostly under the cover of trees, so it was cool even in the midsummer afternoon. The facilities at the site were not particularly amazing, and most of the campsites are on the side of a hill, but it's the beach which makes the campsite unforgettable for me. The beach itself isn't particularly good for swimming. Most of the beach is covered with rocks protruding from the surf, but the sand is as white as anywhere on the Great Ocean Road. I lay on the beach reading Robinson Crusoe for about an hour or two that afternoon. I had been told by my friend's sister that there were glowworms in the rainforest on the south coast, and that she thought they were amazing when she visited the area. So when I was planning my trip, I looked up where to go see them. There was a place not far from Joanna Beach where the glowworms were said to be common. I got to the rainforest where the glowworms were supposed to be about 40 minutes before the sun went down and sat around for a while enjoying the forest. I began walking as it was getting dark. Apparently, the glowworms will not light up if there is a torch or any light around, so I walked through the twilight and let my eyes adjust. The forest was pretty magical by itself, and it was getting close to dark when I reached the end point of the trail. There was a small wooden platform built like a boardwalk over the top of a medium-sized waterfall. The mossy ground below was covered with ferns and dense foliage. I sat on a bench on the platform and waited. As the darkness thickened, I looked around, constantly watching for any points of light. The bioluminescent glow was, at first, so faint that I almost wasn't sure that it was really there, but as it got darker, I could see the definite glow of the glowworms below in the mossy undergrowth. When it was fully dark, it looked almost as though there was a blanket of stars on the rainforest floor. I sat for a long time just watching and enjoying the cool forest and the glow of the insects. Back at the beach campsite, I ate some dinner. I grabbed a beer and wandered down to the beach. As I walked over the beach, I saw numerous little glowing lights along the beach, not dissimilar to the glowworms. These lights bobbed up and down and sometimes flicked quickly back and forth. After a minute of confusion, I realized they were glow-in-the-dark markers on fishing rods that people were using to fish on the beach at night. There was a surprising number of people on the beach. I could see their torches down in the distance. Joanna Beach must be a popular spot, not for swimming, but for fishing. As I wandered along the beach further, there were various huge rock formations which were further up from the sand, away from the water. Most of these could be easily walked up, and I imagined at high tide they were partially underwater. After Cape Otway, I kept on, continuing along the scenic road. Eventually, the steep cliffs and scenic beaches began to peter out, and the road became more of a country road, the kind you might see anywhere in Victoria. I soon passed into Port Ferry, which was a charming town, but you'd be forgiven for missing it on the road, and I continued again to Portland, which was a small city. I had travelled from Cape Otway to Portland in the morning, and it was now mid-afternoon. I decided to make a gambit and try to get to Mount Gambier to find a caravan park to sleep. I remember this day in particular because after I reached Mount Gambier in the afternoon, I was so exhausted I hardly had enough energy to find dinner and then set up my tent. I lay on my camping mat and listened to the audiobook of the short novel The Skin Trade by George R.R. Martin. Something about the cool evening under the trees in the caravan park impressed deeply on my memory. Mount Gambier is a small town named after the mountain which is close by, and it's special for a few reasons. The first is that there are various sinkholes around the town, which the council has turned into quite spectacular gardens. In the town centre, there's a small sinkhole which you can see, but the most impressive garden is a bit out of town. It's a large sinkhole about 100 meters across. Vines hang from the walls and flowers were planted along the floor. You can walk down into the sinkhole, which is about 20 meters deep, and it's really quite a nice place to stop. It isn't really one of the main tourist locations, so it's usually pretty empty. The second sight to see in Mount Gambier is the Blue Lake, which I believe was also a sinkhole, but was filled in, and the water in the lake has become impossibly blue, which is really stunning to see in person. If you saw the lake in pictures, you'd be forgiven for thinking there was filter on the photo, but actually the deep blue sapphire color is from the minerals in the rock bed of the lake. The town has a really nicely maintained walking route around the lake, which you can take if you want, and I recommend that you do. This was the point in the journey when I decided to head home. I was nearly at the end of my leave from work, and I was exhausted down to my bones. I had only been gone for 12 days at this point, but I had underestimated how strenuous motorcycle touring was. Setting up the tent every night, riding all day, constant pain in my back, and the desire for my own bed won out in the end, and I desperately wanted to be home again. So I turned my bike around and sped back across country Victoria, back to Canberra. The last thing I want to talk about in the video is the return trip over Mt Hotham. Skip to 21 minutes and 45 seconds to hear about my return trip over Mt Hotham. It was in the evening, and I wanted to get to the town called Bright in order to make camp, but to do so I had to ride across Mt Hotham. It was late in the evening, and I thought I could make it before it got dark, so I decided to venture over the mountain. As I got to the top, the sun was setting, and the clouds were actually quite low and thick, so they were drifting across the mountain top and across the road. You can see in the video that I literally rode through clouds as I went across the mountain. I'll leave you with this video to end.